The cost of British Columbia's Site C Dam in the northeast reaches of the province has ballooned from an initial estimate of 3.3 billion to 16 billion and counting. But opponents of the megadam say it poses an even greater cost to the climate. BC Hydro, the owners, say the power that will come from harnessing the Peace River will be clean energy. Increasingly, those critics are crying foul.
Hi, I'm Gary Wachner with the Waterkeeper Alliance.
Gary Wachner is among the most prominent opponents of megadams. As an environmental activist, scientist, and author, he has paddled rivers worldwide and undertaken and reviewed numerous studies of dams.
They drain and destroy rivers. They stop water flowing. They stop fish from moving up and down in rivers. They oftentimes, flood massive amounts of habitat or cause deforestation. And they oftentimes have extreme negative impacts on local people. But the science that I particularly focus on, which has just come about in about the last 30 years, is the greenhouse gas emissions from hydropower dams and reservoirs. And so it's relatively new science, but it's becoming increasingly accepted. It's actually even a part of the IPCC's protocol, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, back in 2006. So it's been around, for 16 years, at least accepted by the IPCC. And you don't hear about it as often, but there's more and more news articles, more and more research going on about the greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by reservoir operations and hydropower.
Why is that a concern? And why is the UN's own body looking at that more seriously now, you're suggesting, than ever before?
The previous concept was that hydropower was quote unquote clean energy and that it had zero emissions. And you can still see lots of hydropower companies, organizations, government bodies, etc., claiming that the emissions are zero, but it is absolutely not true. In some places, especially in the tropical parts of the world, the emissions that can come out of a hydropower facility can be as bad or worse than a coal-fired power plant. And so I can get into the science about why that is, but hydropower is marketed as clean energy, and it's not clean. It causes greenhouse gas emissions, and it is absolutely a false solution to climate change. We're going to make things as bad or worse if you stop using fossil fuels and switch over to hydropower.
That's a very dramatic statement. Let's drill a little bit deeper in there, so to speak, and look at why you feel that's happening. What's going on in the process of a megadam in particular, something like Site C, which we have under construction here in British Columbia, that makes it so, in your view, pernicious?
Yeah, there's multiple sources of greenhouse gas emissions that come from a reservoir. One of the big initial ones is you get significant amount of deforestation. There are millions of acres of forests across the planet which have been cut down for hydropower reservoirs. So because the reservoir floods the forest, and they usually cut it down before it floods. And so the massive deforestation is a big issue. The second big issue is when you construct hydropower dams, there's extraordinary amounts of emissions associated with the construction. That's usually around the creation of concrete. Concrete is very highly energy intensive, so it's just massive emissions associated with concrete. But the significant piece that is unique to reservoirs and hydropower dams are the GHG emissions that are caused by organic material that's flowing in the streams, that grows on the banks of the reservoir, and that is in the leaf litter that drops into the reservoir. And organic material, when it decomposes underwater, it's called anaerobic decomposition, and that creates methane. And so you can get extraordinary methane emissions from some hydropower reservoirs, especially in the tropics, but it also occurs across the United States and in places and in spots in Canada.
Gary notes that the biggest greenhouse gas threat from reservoirs and dams is methane, which can be up to 100 times more efficient in absorbing heat than carbon dioxide.
And so it's a very serious greenhouse gas. And so it happens in a reservoir situation. And this graphic kind of describes what happens.
Gary's explanation starts at the top left of the graphic.
So you get decaying plant matter that flows down into a reservoir. Reservoirs usually, especially hydropower reservoirs, they go up and down, and it's generally seasonal. And so when they go down, you'll get extraordinary amounts of vegetation that grows on the banks where the reservoir went down, and then the reservoir goes back up, and all of that vegetation is flooded. And so the more organic material you have in the soils that got flooded, the more off-gassing and degassing you get of methane. And so these emissions can be very significant, especially in wetter climates and warmer climates. They can be very, very significant. There in Canada, even though it's obviously in most places it's fairly wet, so it's very important. There you have a lot of vegetation, you have a lot of organic material flowing into reservoirs, and so you definitely get greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions from these reservoirs.
At the request of XRTV Victoria, Gary and a colleague did an analysis of the likely greenhouse gas emissions from the Site C dam, based on what he calls the best available science.
And you see this X right here is the yearly Site C emissions estimates. That is around 400 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour. And that's about roughly the same as the very low end of natural gas. So those are the yearly emissions. Site C, right on its webpage, it says that their emissions are estimated to be 10 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. The best available science does not agree with that. It estimates that the emissions are around 400, so right around here. So 40 times higher than what the Site C quote unquote clean energy project is telling the public.
BC Hydro also says on its website that its hydropower will be greener than solar or wind.
The best available science indicates that that is not true. The best available science indicates that the Site C project will probably be about twice as bad as solar, and maybe 10 times as bad as wind in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions. And these are estimates that are accepted in the scientific community. We'd have to find out how BC Hydro decided the number was 10 when our best estimate is that it's 400 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour.
We'd like that answer too. We contacted BC Hydro repeatedly to try to get responses to what Gary and his associate found. Not a word back. Order of Canada recipient Vicki Husband is a longtime critic of Site C. She was not surprised to learn about the estimated greenhouse gas emissions of the mega dam.
Because we knew they would be massive, because it's the destruction of that whole valley and what was there, and it continues to emit greenhouse gases. The dams are not green. They're very destructive. They are false climate solutions, and we have alternatives.
Like solar and wind, Vicki agrees with Gary that those alternative fuels would prove much healthier for the environment and biodiversity.
And lower not just GHG emissions, but so much lower impact on the land. They don't destroy rivers. They don't destroy forests.
The West Moberly First Nation has been fighting Site C, which will flood its ancestral burial grounds and ceremonial sites.
From the very beginning of this whole process, we stated that we weren't opposed to the creation of the energy. What we're opposed to is the destruction of the valley.
The destruction is widespread. Forests, clear-cut, prime agricultural land, bulldozed. The West Moberly recently won the right to financial and safety documents that BC Hydro had tried to keep secret. but the First Nation had to sign a confidentiality agreement not to release the information to the public.
That's how tight the release of information is. So they don't want it out there because they must know somewhere that there are major problems, but this was just another one. People believe somehow that dams are good. Dams are one of the most destructive things we can ever do, and that's what's happening up there, and it just kills me to think about it.
It's being called a legal bombshell. The BC Supreme Court ruling on June 29th that the province violated key provisions of a major treaty when it permitted widespread industrial development on the traditional lands of the Blueberry River First Nations. Those industrial activities included the Site C Dam, as well as oil and natural gas operations. This victory strengthens the landmark legal case against the Site C Dam by the West Moberly First Nations, according to Chief Roland Wilson. I think this gives us a pretty big stick in the fight, he told the Narwhal magazine.